shifting, and COVID-19. Again, another very timely topic by a leading person in the field. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Mr. George Pezzold, my colleague, who is also the Executive Director of the Transportation Logistics Council. George?
Thank you. Well, am I on?
You are on, George.
Okay. Good afternoon and welcome to New Dimensions. As Brent says, I'm George Pezzold and the Executive Director of the Transportation Logistics Council. For actually over 46 years, the Council has been recognized for its educational programs and materials, and by our motto, education for transportation professionals. And I would be remiss if I didn't urge you to check out the benefits of membership. Well, that said, before introducing our presenter for this virtual workshop, I'd like to give you a little history of freight classification and pricing. The classification of freight based on the weight, bulk, and value of a commodity actually goes back to the practices of the individual railroads in the 1800s, even before Congress passed the Interstate Commerce Act. The first national freight classification was published shortly after the Motor Carrier Act in 1935 and became effective some 84 years ago. Initially, it was published by the American Trucking Associations until 1956, when the National Motor Freight Traffic Association took over responsibility for it. Over the years, the NMFC has been the standard basis for the LTL trucking industry pricing and freight rates, but that has recently started to change, as you're about to learn. My friend Don Newell is one of the leading experts on LTL pricing. Don's had 28 years of experience in the LTL industry before he joined NMFTA in 2004, where he became a member of the Commodity Classification Board. Where, well, at NMFTA, Don developed and implemented their weighing and research and educational programs and represented NMFTA numerous public appearances, including our council's annual conferences. He retired in 2018 with a total of 48 years in the business, and then established his own consulting firm, Newell Enterprises, now specializing in helping carriers, 3PLs, and shippers and others. And he offers training to those interested in learning how LTL rates are determined, whether using the NMFC or alternate methods such as density costing. Whenever I have a question, I call Don Newell. So welcome, Don Newell and New Dimensions. Thank you.
Thank you, George. Dan, just confirm I'm on, please.
You are on.
Thank you very much. Very kind words, George. I appreciate that. Hopefully I'll prove deserving of them. Okay. New dimensions. These three bullets form the crux of our discussion today. We're going to talk about the LTL trucking industry and has it been moving forward to new pricing methodologies, the NMFC, and how it's classifying more products with density-based classifications, and the fact that major LTL carriers, most of them, if not all of them, have instituted dimensional weight rating with cubic scanners. So I'm going to hit these one at a time. As Dan said, send your questions in, but I will hold off answering them until the presentation is over. Okay. I probably become tiresome with this a little bit because this is one of my pet peeves. Everybody refers to density pricing systems or NMFC pricing, but they are not really pricing methodologies. They are methods of costing freight, that is, determining the cost factors that are associated with different kinds of products and different shipments. The fact is that if you know the costs, you can then price. So they're not technically pricing methodologies, but I think I'm going to give this one up and just let the business and the industry do what they want. I'll keep calling it costing, but everybody else will call it pricing. Okay, the NMFC, has it reclassified hundreds of articles with density-based classifications? Well, that's kind of a yes and no. In an effort to make the classification easier, they have taken a lot of individual product classification provisions that may have had one or two freight classes. They've looked at them and they've determined that the products themselves have no negative transportation characteristics. And remember that phrase, transportation characteristics. We will be talking about that quite a bit later on. Therefore, density is the only factor involved in their costing. So they've eliminated the single product class that had no mention of density and rolled them into some of the full scale, or what we call NOI provisions. And for those of you who do not know what NOI stands for, it stands for not otherwise indexed. Not otherwise indexed in the NMFC. The old phrase used to be NOI-BN. If you're an old timer like me and maybe Brent and maybe George, NOI-BN was not otherwise indexed by name. So that was shortened to NOI. So yes, the NMFC has been canceling single products, rolling them into full-scale density, but they have never really gone on a rampage to establish new full-scale density provisions. There are still literally thousands of provisions in the NMFC that do not even mention density. Okay, let's talk about dimensional weight rating with cubic scanners. Well, the fact of the matter is that many carriers do have cubic scanners. I will show you a few varieties of them near the end of the presentation so you have an idea of what they do and what they look like. But the fact is currently, as far as I know, based on my discussions with contacts within the industry, and after many more than 40 years, I have a lot of contacts. There are carriers who have some density-based pricing provisions or costing provisions, but they have not instituted them wholesale across their systems. I don't know of any LTL carrier, large or small, that is forcing density-based costing and pricing on their customers. They're offering it sometimes. They might have certain special rules in their tariffs that refer to it, but they are not going wholesale yet to density-based costing. Okay, costing. Let's talk about costing. LTL cost factors. There's fixed costs, like with a lot of businesses, the overhead, the buildings and insurance, utilities, etc., that must be paid to maintain the business, regardless of how much business the LTL carrier is carrying. At least they're mostly fixed. They might be able to adjust them a little bit here and there. It's the variable costs that the freight charges are designed to cover. And they're the ones that go up and down depending on a variety of things, like the traffic that the carrier is carrying. Pandemics, when the pandemic first started, LTL carriers almost shut down because nobody was shipping anything until people figured out how to do it. And then when the traffic is booming, those are the costs that go up. Trucks, depreciation, fuel and maintenance, people wages, etc. Let's talk a little bit more about the variable costs and controlling them. P&D stands for pickup and delivery. These are the trucks, not usually tractor trailers, but sometimes, but straight trucks, maybe even vans that go out in the street to deliver shipments to the customers, to the consignees, and pick up shipments from the shippers to roll back into the terminal and put them into the system. Controlling the costs of P&D involve making sure the routes are efficient, that there's not too many drivers driving around out there for the amount of business that is available for the day. So they have to know the workload ahead of time to plan those routes and then make sure the drivers are prepared to efficiently run those routes without wasting time and driving circuitous miles. Any mile that they're driving that's not on a route to pick up or deliver freight is circuitous and it's extra cost. Back at the dock, handling shipments off and on the trucks and trailers, the idea again is to use as little manpower and time as possible. So again, they need to know the workload. They know how many, hopefully from P&D, they know how many shipments are being picked up. So they're going to be able to work that. And they know if they're getting trailers coming in for inbound freight, they know how many shipments are there. So they try to plan to use as little manpower and time as possible to be efficient and cost effective. You may or may not have known this last bullet, but it is the truth. This is a fact. The largest single cost area for LTL carriers is line haul. Those are the trips between break bulks or distribution centers. Most break bulks in my old carrier, I used to work for Roadway Express, most break bulks also still picked up freight in their local area. A few didn't, they specialized. But when a break bulk loads a trailer, for example, I worked in Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania, we would load a trailer going to Chicago, to Dallas, to Denver, to Los Angeles. Those are long distances. And we're going to talk about the costs involved in working with line haul. Fuel. How much does diesel fuel cost? Well, it's actually fairly reasonable right now. It used to be as much as $1 more than gas, but right now, from what I've seen, it's 22 to 25 cents per gallon more than gas. Not too bad, but still more expensive. But then when you consider the mileage of those big tractor trailers, averaging right now somewhere around 6 miles a gallon, you can get an idea of how much money these carriers are spending on fuel. It's a lot. It's a big chunk. I think I recall it being represented as somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 or 40% of line haul cost is fuel. Don't quote me on that one. Personnel, long haul drivers paid somewhere between 28 to 40 cents. These days with the driver shortage, I've seen some companies offering 45, 50, even 53 or 4 cents per mile. Just do the math, 1,000 miles at 50 cents a mile is $500. So that's a good chunk. And these trips are more than 1,000 miles. Local drivers and some of the line haul drivers are also paid hourly. And the hourly rates are usually $20 an hour or more, depending on if there's benefits thrown in there. It could be even more expensive. Then there's the mechanics. The carriers do their own service work most of the time, unless they're very small and have contracted with somebody to do it for them. Mechanics are making $20, $25 an hour too. So gives you an idea of some of the costs, and we actually know, roughly at least, how much it costs per mile. ATRI, American Transportation Research Institute, gathers all the data every year from as many carriers who are willing to exchange that data for receiving data in return. The last report that was published was the report for 2018. It came out in late 2019. The 2019 report should be coming out in hopefully before the end of November. But there's the link for ATRI, or you can just Google it to find out what they do. In 2018, the average cost for running a mile of LTL was $1.90 per mile. Multiply that by 1,000, that's $1,900. $1,900 for a tractor trailer to move 1,000 miles across this country. Some of the LTL carriers specialize in short haul, and their average length of haul are somewhere 400, 500, 600. But the national long haul LTL people are going 700, 800, 900 and up to 1,200 miles on some of those trips. This is one of the basics I've used for 30 or 40 years when I've been training people on classification and cost and so forth. The LTL's product is space on their equipment. I've asked LTL salespeople, what is their product? And they've told me service, they told me on time, intact delivery, all these fancy things. Bottom line is they rent or sell space on their equipment. LTL pricing has to be formulated to address all the handling costs, but the best way is to ensure that the pricing is set to cover the costs of the space. And in order to make sure that is done as efficiently and economically as possible, those trailers have to be filled up. The goal when I was on the dock at Roadway was, we didn't say 100% because it was never going to be 100, but we would write a manifest when we're done closing it saying it was 98% full. It was the best we could do. So, space. Okay, the price must cover the cost. Space occupied must earn its fair share. What measure most closely fits the cost of space? Is it weight? Is it the cost? Is it the shape? It's the density. Obviously, density is the best way to measure track use of space. But I got a question for you. If that's true, if the carriers are charging for the space on their trucks, why are the rates in pounds? Think about that for a minute. Most LTL rates are X dollars per 100 pounds. So, density rates or cubic capacity rates charged by the cube or the space used. So that could be a very good thing going forward. Largest cost factor, pricing must compensate for all the space. So I already said density was the one that measures it right. So are we done? Could I just close up and start answering questions? Maybe, but I don't think so. I don't know how many, if we were doing this in person, I would now ask how many of you have ever been on an LTL dock. So raise your hands and make yourself happy. I wish I could tell, because this is the kind of stuff you see on LTL docks. If we're trying to completely fill 100% of the trailer cube, what does this kind of shipment, these kinds of shipments, do to the ability to fill up a truck, fill up a trailer? It destroys it. And that is a fact. 28 years on a dock at Roadway, I saw this stuff every day. It's not a majority of the freight, but when it happens, it excessively impacts the ability of the carrier to fill up its cube, to fully utilize its cube, and therefore the costs of dealing with stuff like this is way different than dealing with costs of other regular freight. Okay, before we move further, read that first paragraph. I could read it for you, but hopefully your screens are showing you. That first paragraph is actually a statement from the CCSB. The CCSB is the Commodity Classification Standards Board of NMFTA, the National Motor Freight Traffic Association. As George told you, I was on the CCSB for about 10, 11 years. And that is the body that decides what classification provisions actually get published in the NMFC. So the CCSB itself clearly states that density has been established to be the primary importance for freight characteristics for classes. It says, absent any unusual or significant handling, stowability, or liability characteristics, density is of prime importance. So even the CCSB and NMFTA admit that density is the big deal. So why are they continuing to publish other kinds of classes that aren't entirely based on density? Well, before we get into that, and I will be getting into that in a few slides here, what is density-based pricing? Advocates and supporters of density-based costing pricing say these things, that it ties the charges directly to the space, which that's what the carriers should want to do, that it's not new, and it's not new. Spot pricing, import-export tariffs, pallet or skid rates, these are all methods of charging for the space, so they're kind of been there for a while. But I'll show you a couple options that might be used for density-based costing. This is a simple one, density to class conversion. These charts on the screen are actually copies of the CCSB density guidelines. When the CCSB is establishing new provisions for certain products, they start with the product's average density. If it has a tight range, it doesn't go from 1 to 23 pounds per cubic foot, but maybe it goes from 8 to 9 pounds per cubic foot with an average of 8.5, then you would look at the chart and the density would be between 8.0 and 8.9, top of the chart on the right, and that would be associated with a class 110, and that's how the CCSB would start. They would say, okay, this particular product is going to get a 110. However, if there are other factors, that could change. So somebody wants to publish a density-based pricing format, they could just do this. Very simple, very easy. CCSB uses it itself. Another version is dim factor. Those of you who are involved with shipping air freight, shipping with the big package carriers, UPS, FedEx, etc. There is a dimensional weight provision, establishing a minimum charge for the cubic space. They take the length, width, height divided by the dim factor, and 194, 166. There's a couple different ones depending on who the carrier is and what the traffic is. The carriers then charge the greater of the actual or the dim weight. For example, a 48 by 48 by 48 divided by 194, 570 pounds would get to 8.9 PCF, and that would be what the carrier's shooting for. Okay, so that's dimensional weight. There are other forms, and you can ask me questions about them, but I don't want to spend all day, the rest of the time, looking at that. One thing to give you a heads up about, and actually I was on a panel at the last Transportation Logistics Council meeting, and one of the people involved in that panel with me had this slide, so I've borrowed it. This is to make you aware that many LTL carriers are not just analyzing the freight as if it were a solid cube. If you can't stack on top of it, if it's a pyramid skid or for whatever reason the top cannot be loaded on, they are beginning to measure higher, maybe to 84 inches or something like that. And this slide would make you aware of that. The average dims, the density, and then there's the loaded density, like the first line, 16.9 pounds per cubic foot, but the loaded density is 9.2, meaning it takes up a lot more space than something that's 16.9 PCF. So they're going to charge you more. So be aware that that's going on too. Now I went online, I looked at a few websites to see what's happening. This is right from the YRC website, so it's public knowledge. Dimensional freight quote. This is a quote screen where the carrier or the shipper could choose to fill in. If you look down at the bottom, there's the length, width, and height, and there's a weight. One pallet, 48, 40 by 45, 500 pounds. That works out to 10 pounds per cubic foot, and they will then apply a minimum charge for that density. So they have it available. They're not forcing it, but they're making it available, and I'm assuming they're trying to sell it, but I haven't heard much more about it. Another one, a slightly different issue here. This is from ABF's website. Cubic minimum charge. This one is different. The miles are listed on the left, and the cubic capacity is on the right. In this case, ABF will charge something in column 0 to 250 for anything that is 0 to 250 cubic feet. Let's say we have 100 cubic feet and it's going 200 cubic feet is my example on the slide. It's going 800 miles. You look at the 750 to 1,000 mile line and 200, it's going to be $2.60 per cubic foot. 260 times 200, $520. So that's the ABF's cubic minimum charge. Okay, if you know of more and you want to ask me about them, feel free to set the Q&A up, and if we can, we'll get to them at the end. Now, NMFC, National Motor Freight Classification. How does it handle costs? Well, we know that the CCSB already said density is the prime factor, absent any other characteristics, and here's where we're going to start talking about the characteristics. By the way, that is the link to the CCSB procedures. The CCSB does everything absolutely above board. They follow procedures that are published on their website. Anybody can go look at them. You can find the stuff that I'm throwing up on these slides right there on their website anytime you want. And they say when evaluating commodities for the assignment of classes, they must consider density, handling, stowability, and liability. Now, you may think you know what handling, stowability, and liability are, but I'm going to make sure. Density is easy, and it works extremely well with freight like this. LTL people call this regular freight. It's a solid cube. It's got straight sides, so other stuff can be loaded next to it without any special deal. That, and more important, or at least as important, load-bearing top. If the top can't handle anything being stacked on it, then that's not load-bearing, and then it would be an additional cost factor for stowability. Let's look at handling. Density doesn't work too well with this stuff, folks. That's bundle of pipe on the left. It's about 20, maybe 22 feet long, maybe more. I don't know. And that is a nice big excavator bucket on the right. Those things are very hard to handle on a dock. And unfortunately, they can't be all nose loaded from the shipper and stay on the same truck until it gets to wherever it's going. I'll tell you, hopefully, a relatively quick story. Bundles of pipe. When I worked the dock at Stroudsburg, and I worked at Harrisburg a little bit too for Roadway Express, anytime I walked down the dock and I saw a quiet zone, people were not doing much. I figured there was something special going on, and 9 times out of 10, it was a bundle of pipe like this or something long and awkward. Yes, they move that stuff with a forklift. They might have to chain it so that they can try to pick up the far end, or they might be dragging it. But if it's 20 feet long and a forklift is pulling it out of its trailer, that forklift driver is backing straight out. With most pallets, they are starting to turn to get going in their direction of travel as they're coming out the door of the trailer. They turn and go with hardly a stop. But with stuff like this, they pull it out slowly, and they back out until the front of that bundle is all the way out before they start turning. And then they turn slowly, make sure they don't hit anything or anybody. And then as they go down the dock, everybody's watching it and staying out of the way. I call it a traveling zone of non-work. So in addition to the simple costs of handling that long bundle of pipe, the carrier is paying for all those extra minutes. And it might only be 2 or 3 minutes where somebody is standing back and staying out of the way. But if it's 30 or 40 or 50 people spending 2 or 3 minutes staying out of the way, we're talking hours at $25, $30 an hour, counting benefits. It might be as much as $40, $50 an hour extra cost for handling that shipment. The bucket, not quite as difficult and not quite as distracting as the bundle of pipe, but it is still just immensely difficult to handle that without damaging it or hurting somebody. So that's handling. A lot of handling issues can be stowing issues too. Stowability. This stuff, and I'll tell you what it is in a moment, this stuff can be extremely difficult for a dock worker to try to fill around with nice square cartons of freight. That thing on the left, that happens to be a bundle on a rack of loose scaffold fittings and components. They're sharp. They can cut not only freight, but people. So it's very dangerous to try to load around there. So the stowability of that particular shipment was way out of whack for the density of that. Now, the one on the right, it's not as dangerous, but it can still be very difficult to load freight around. That happens to be a dog kennel in panels, and when it gets wherever it's going, they just take the panels off and clamp them together, and they have a dog kennel. So stowability can also be an extremely difficult issue. Then there's liability. I would guess that you understand the liability of the hazardous materials. Hazmat spills cost carriers thousands of dollars to fix, to clean up. Not to mention the potential liability, environmental liability, safety liability, and so forth. That thousands could end up being millions. So obviously that's a liability. The thing on the right, if you can make it out, it's a Rolex watch. Nice and portable and expensive. Stuff like that can disappear off a dock before you even look at the box. So value has an impact on the liability also. Okay, now we've looked at the transportation characteristics. Let's look at the actual process that the CCSB uses to classify freight. The first step is research. They have to research products in order to determine those transportation characteristics. And there's the classification research projects, the paragraphs at the bottom are just an intro to what those projects are, what they're about. You can go see this list at nmfta.org. If you're interested in what they're looking at to change, there's no better place to look at than their website. You'll get, and this is just a small snip of the current research project list. There are over 70 projects listed, and this is 5 or 6 of them. What the project is, it'll give NMFC numbers if it's pertinent. They'll give you a number. They'll tell you what date it was actually assigned. So that top one was assigned of October this year to Aaron Topper. Aaron Topper is a CCSB member and the packaging engineer for the NMFTA. And it's an active status. The one right below it, May 2018, that's a little bit, quite a bit older. Keith Charles is running, is in charge of that one, and it's been docketed. When you see docketed, that means that that research project has a proposal on it that has been written up and is on the docket for the CCSB to hear at their next meeting. So there's 2 docketed projects here, and there's 4 active ones. Okay, this is busy. I'm not going to read this. I just really advise you to go to the NMFC, nmfta.org, and click under classification and pages, classification making, and you will find out exactly how proposals are developed for new classification provisions. If you've got a shipper who doesn't like their classification and they want to change it, direct them to this page if you're a 3PL. If you are a shipper and want to impact your classification, this is where you go. nmft.org/pages/classification making. So you can learn how to do it. They'll even give you the form. There's a link on it to download the proposal forms. Furthermore, same area, this time pages and public docket files. Anyone with access to a computer and Wi-Fi, obviously, or internet, can know what is changing and when. The NMFTA docket files list the public dockets. The current docket, the last docket was heard last month in October 2020-3. And you click on the underline, the link for 2020-3, and you get the actual provisions and proposals that they are looking at. For example, 2020-3, subject 1 was for electrical controllers, including motor controllers. It gives you items 61,480 and 63,150. So they're looking at that, or they did look at it. You can go online right now. Well, please wait till I'm done. But you can go online after we get off and you can look at what they did. There's disposition. There's the PowerPoint that they used to review it. There's an analysis, a spreadsheet, a notification list of who was involved, etc. As shippers or 3PLs, I think it would be quite valuable to know what is potentially changing in the NMFC and when. And you can also know how it's changing. By clicking on that subject from the previous page, you actually get to the proposed classification provisions. In this case, item 61,270, battery chargers, used to be a class 70, and in a package when they weigh 25s. So there was some special packaging, but they are canceling that. That is the proposals to cancel 61,270 and roll it into 61,700 for electrical appliances or instruments NOI, which, as you can see, is a full-scale density 11 sub-density provision. So the class for chargers could go up, but could also go down if it's 22.5 pounds per cubic foot or more. So we know when it's changing, we know what it's changing and how, also why. At the end of the proposal, they show a relationship to the CCSB policies and guidelines, and they state the case. No unusual or significant handling, stowability, liability considerations have been identified. Thus, density is the governing characteristic. Therefore, they've rolled it into the full-scale density. That's how the NMFC is developed. That's how stuff gets published in it. You, as a shipper or 3PL or carriers for that matter, can be involved and aware. Just be aware of what's on that website. Question, is it still valid? I've already said this. I don't know of any carriers that are forcing density pricing onto their shippers. There might be some out there. There's certainly some that have it and promote it, but I don't see it being forced. And the NMFC has been moving towards density-related classification. Well, they meet 3 times a year, and they hear between 20 and 25 proposals. So they might change 60 to 75 product classifications a year. The book's got almost 8,000 provisions. So that's not wholesale moving towards density. You tell me, is the big switch from NMFC to density on? Remember, the real purpose of capturing dimensions is to help cost the freight better. Are the LTL carriers switching away from the NMFC for pricing? They're using scanners, they're using guys with and gals with tape measures to determine the dimensions and the cube and the density of shipments. But are they actually using that stuff for pricing? In some cases, as I've shown you, yeah. But are they really forcing that issue? I'm not so sure. Oh, by the way, I had a conversation with the executive director of NMFTA, and the NMFTA and the CCSB is looking at a new process for reviewing the current, they're reviewing the current classification process with the idea of making it more responsive and more data driven. I'm not sure what that means, and they didn't give me much of a hint about it, but it could be big. It could lead to more density-based classification. That's just a wild guess. I don't know. But if you keep an eye on the nmfta.org website, you should hear more about those potential changes before their next meeting in February. Okay, I sound like a broken record here. Are they using more density or dimensional costing structures? Yes, I think so. They're much more aware of dimensions. There are carriers who have deployed hundreds of static dimensioners, and we're going to be coming up to some pictures on them here pretty soon. So they're getting the dimensions more frequently than they ever have. So they can roll those into their costing structures. What they cost for what kind of price still remains to be seen. But they do have an impact on the carrier cost. What can shippers do to help themselves? There's a little list there. Try to make your packages smaller with the same product in it. That would increase density. Try to make them all rectangular, flat, usable, load-bearing tops so that the carriers can fully utilize their own equipment. Carriers who pick up shipments that prohibit them from utilizing their own equipment, in other words, prohibit them from selling their own product, they tend to start price adjusting that kind of freight. So be aware of that when you ship something out the door. Benefit to the carriers of density. The rates can be set in line with costs, more compact packaging in theory. If some shippers pay attention and do improve their packaging, that's great. It does improve their costing information. It theoretically can improve their load planning. Does it eliminate FAKs? I heard that back in, first time I dealt with density-based, I was on a stage at SMC in front of 400 or 500 people on a panel talking about density-based pricing versus NMFC. So it's not brand new. Somebody in the audience said, would they reset rates? Would this eliminate FAKs? Well, yeah, maybe, but don't for a moment think that large shippers who have millions of dollars worth of freight spend wouldn't have clout enough to say, yeah, I know my densities, but I want you to just charge me for this density. A density all kinds. I'll guarantee that'll happen. And the potential to homogenize price methods, parcel, truckload, air, ocean. So that's some of the potential benefits for carriers. Benefit for shippers, if they do densify their freight with more efficient packaging, they're going to they're going to reap the reward of lower rates. It also should reduce rate surprises from cubic capacity rules, those special rules. It eliminates the risk of NMFC reclassification, but it doesn't eliminate the risk of density corrections, reduce billing errors, etc. So there's some good stuff that can benefit both carriers and shippers. Getting close to wrapping up here. Carriers can and will publish rules to address shipments with other issues, like the pipe and the bucket and stuff like that. They're not going to just charge you for the space they take up. They're going to charge you for the other space it prevents from being filled. So they're going to have special rules. All those rules are going to be different. So the idea that density-based pricing will make everything simpler is a pipe dream. It'll make it simpler if you ship solid, square, load-bearing surface pallets. Could result in hundreds of different rules, hundreds of different kinds of charges. Is it more real today? Yeah, I think so. It's not entirely real. It's not broad spread. It does match up with what the rest of the world does. They charge by space. The sophistication of transportation management systems can use that data. All kinds of data transmissions, dimensioning technologies, etc. But bottom line, shippers are focused on the final price, not discounts. Okay. Here we go. Only have a few slides left. Legal for trade dimensioning equipment, static mounted. These are a couple different brands, and you put a pallet underneath, and they do their thing, and they collect the dimensions. Relatively new on the scene, dim in motion. This is a drive-through ceiling mounted dimensioner. The forklift never stops. The problem with it right now is there's still some wrinkles. For example, sometimes the driver has to circle around and drive through again. Might have been going too fast, might have been going crooked. So there's some issues involved there, but it will be perfected and out there more prominently sooner or later. And then there's the old handheld. This is a tape measure, folks, but it's got a barcode reader, and it is legal for trade dimensioning equipment. Carriers don't use a lot of it. There's a couple that use it, but I'll tell you who uses it, warehouses. Warehouses that have to have legal for trade dimensions for everything going out the door to the carriers, they might find it useful. So very affordable, a lot cheaper than those ceiling mounted ones. Shippers. Here's what you can do. Whether you're shipping NMFC or under density base, work with your carriers. Give them clear, complete bills of lading. Know your product, what it is, and if you're using NMFC, know their NMFC provisions. You have people who could help you do that. The carriers will help you do that. The NMFTA will help you do that. Heck, I'll help you do that. Get the NMFC provisions for your freight, and then you will just have to, rather than just putting the class, get a good description, an NMFC number, sub-provision if applicable, give that information to your carrier. Type of packaging, be accurate with the weight and dimensions if you're using them. Here's a few examples of bills of lading that aren't so good. The yellow block is where they should be putting a description. There is none. There's no description. I have no idea what they're going to be charged for this shipment, but neither do they. Here's another one. That's a great description. Can you read that? It says, highlighted in yellow, it says undetermined freight. But it's a class 175, apparently. Is it? Carrier's not going to know, so guess what? They're probably going to look at that one. How about this one? Same issues. So if you are a shipper, please look at your bill of lading process. If you are 3PLs, help your shippers with the bill of lading process to get them to be as accurate and complete as possible to avoid issues with your carriers. Again, if you need help with NMFC, some of your 3PLs will do that. NMFC will do that. NMFTA will do that. You can contact me. I might be able to help you. Either way, try to make those bills of lading solid. Okay, That's it, folks. Further discussion, hopefully. Is the big switch inevitable? You tell me. Look at your questions. Dan, should I shut this down?
Yeah, if you want to shut off. And Brent, I believe, wanted to say a word as I open everybody up for the Q&A period. So, Brent? Well, while Brent is unmuting himself, Matthew asked a question, Don. What if you can't provide a description because of the nature of your business?
I'm ready to go here.
Okay.
Dan, I'm ready to go here a minute.
Go ahead, Brent.
Okay, so as I started to say, and I kind of proved my own point, hang on just a second. I got to do one little task here. We're attorneys, consultants, office managers, member registrars. So we're learning our way through this. But one technique I think we know how to do, Dan, let me know if there's a way you can unmute all and we could get a round of applause for Don. This was an awesome presentation.
I am in the process. I have to unmute everybody one at a time.
I appreciate the thought, Brent, but well,
hang on. We're going to give an applause. In the meantime, I want you to know that while we're on this program here, I got an email from Pete Celestina at My Easy Claim. Some of you may have met him at the TLC conferences. He just gave me a little bit more information. He says he's very proud to be the sponsor today. They're the largest provider of cloud-based cargo and vendor claims management software, along with OS&D incident solutions for shippers, hotels, freight brokers, and carriers. So it's used by more than 75,000 companies worldwide. And as I mentioned, you will get a 90-day, no cost, no commitment trial for the Mercury My Easy claim. So I just wanted to add that. And then, Dan, you let us know when you've got everybody unmuted.
Everybody is now unmuted and can ask questions.
Well, before we ask, let's have that big round of applause. I'm hearing silence, so maybe that's a technique we have to work more on.
He unmuted me.
Well, I hear some pattering, some clapping. Okay, great. Maybe I just don't have it loud enough here. So yeah, so I just wanted to say that's great. And let's go with a Q&A. And
okay, I've got a screen, Dan. I have the Q&A screen, so I've opened it up.
Okay.
Let's see. You already answered.
There were a couple during the course about the presentation, which I said I would have to verify afterwards.
Okay, Mr. Tim Tribby, thank you very much. He's telling me he's got to get out of here by 2:00, so thank you for your attention. Matthew, I'm assuming you're talking about having a business where the nature of your product is proprietary and, I don't know, super secret stuff. You still have, if you're shipping LTL, you still have to give the carrier information on the product so that they can properly classify it, or you might have a contract with them whereby you don't have to classify it, but where you've agreed on liability limits and maybe agreed to a density-based costing and rating system. So if you feel that you cannot provide a description to your LTL carrier, you need to talk with your LTL carrier. I won't say it's impossible. Most of the time they want to know what they're carrying, because guess what? They could be responsible if something bad happens due to your shipment. So, but that's something you're going to have to work out with your carriers, how to deal with that. If that doesn't answer your question, type again. Okay.
I believe I have everybody that's on board here in a position where you can unmute yourself and ask any questions.
I do have one more question that was put in on the Q&A. Jim Graham, if carriers all have liability in their rules that is less than $25 per pound, much of it under 10 for most classes, why does liability remain part of the CCSB process? That's a very good question, and hopefully I have a fairly good answer for you. Jim, the NMFTA and the CCSB represent the entire LTL industry. There's 600, 700, 800, maybe more different LTL carriers. Who's going to look at all their rules and find out what they're charging? How many of them will not have rules? So the CCSB and their purpose is to provide for that in the classification so that those carriers who do not wish to publish their own liability rule know that the liability has been addressed for the products. If those carriers have lower liabilities or higher liabilities, they still know that the base class has taken overall liability into account. Carriers are going to do what they want to do, Mr. Graham, and the CCSB will continue looking at liability because it is still a factor. It always will be a factor, and with as many different carriers as there are out there, it's just impossible to say who does and who does not have liability limits. You state if they all have liability in their rules. Well, they don't all have liability. The big ones probably all do. But I hope that answers your question. Okay, anybody want to unmute themselves and ask a question live? Well, that gives me an opening. I wanted to make sure that all attendees had my email address. If you have any questions, any further questions about this topic or any other questions that you think I might be able to assist with, I'd be happy to receive an email. My email address is don, D-O-N, Newell, N-E-W-E-L-L, .2018 at gmail.com. don.newell.2018 at gmail.com. Please write that down. Give me drop me a line anytime you might have a question, or if you think of a question based on the presentation we've just gone over.
Okay, I think this is Brent. I think that concludes us for today. So any of you who want to leave certainly can. We'll stop the recording now. And I also, for those that can stick around, I'd like to, the official part is over, but we're continuing to